Головному спікеру, постійному представнику Міжнародного Валютного Фонду в Україні пані Йості Люнгману, я хотів би наголосити на тому, що сьогоднішня зустріч, вона показує той аспект роботи Міжнародного валютного фонду, який почасти залишається поза увагою, в тому числі і засобів масової інформації. Це аналітична робота і робота над створенням глобальних прогнозів економічного розвитку та регіональних. Кілька департаментів в Міжнародному валютному фонді працює над тим, щоб тримати руку на пульсі глобальної економіки і прогнозувати в коротко- та середньотерміновому періоді, який ж економічний розвиток світової економіки в цілому та конкретних регіонів. Саме для погляду на економічний прогноз розвитку європейської економіки сьогодні ми вас і запросили, оскільки минулого тижня було оприлюднено Europe's Regional Economic Outlook в тому, що стосується Європи. Це погляд, прогноз Міжнародного валютного фонду стосовно економічного розвитку європейської економіки на середньостроковий період. І запрошуємо до презентації цього огляду постійного представника Міжнародного валютного фонду в Україні пана Йосту Люнгмана.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming. It's great to be here. Good to see that that you are prepared to put up with some uncomfortable conditions to listen to this presentation about the economic situation in Europe. So, as Igor was saying, or as I think he was saying, the fund, the IMF, does a lot of things. One of the things that it's doing is that it's monitoring the economic development in the world and produces a number of what we call flagship publications. One of them is the World Economic Outlook that comes out twice a year, that does a deep dive into analyzing the world economy. Another one is the Global Financial Stability Report, which looks into financial markets. It also produces the Fiscal Monitor, which looks more into the fiscal issues in the world. And it does a number of regional reports. The one that we are focusing on today is the European Regional Economic Outlook that comes out twice a year. It comes out in a bigger report, comes out in May, and then there's an update in October. This does an overview of what's happening in Europe and separating out advanced and emerging Europe, and it also looks into, in each issue, it looks deeper into a specific issue. In May, it looked into the wage developments in Europe and was driving wage developments. In this October update, we look into macroprudential policies. I'm not going to say anything about that. I'll focus just on the overview of what's happening in Europe. I will also, during this presentation, bring out Ukraine, because I think that is of specific interest to you. So I'll make reference to developments in Ukraine. I'm going to divide this presentation into basically 4 blocks. The first one talking about the conjuncture that Europe is continuing to grow, but is growing at a slower pace than we previously thought. So we've revised down our growth projections. I will also say something about the headwinds that we are facing and what could weigh on growth in the coming years. And those headwinds, that is a weaker external demand, so weaker global demand. It is higher fuel and commodity prices, and it is capacity constrained. So the the economy is nearing or exceeding its potential. Then I will say something about the coming years and how we see growth developing. So we see a slowdown in growth from about 3% in 2017 to a little bit below 2% in 2019. I will also say something and discuss the risks that we see and the risks of an increasing trade tensions in the world and tighter financial conditions, so difficulty in borrowing on the global markets. And then finally, I will say something about the policies that we recommend that countries undertake, and those focusing on the need to build fiscal space to deal with future downturns, and then also the need to pursue appropriate monetary policies to deal with inflation pressures. So let's start looking first at the economic situation right now in Europe. So what we see in Europe right now is a slowdown. So we see that so this here shows the annualized, seasonally adjusted quarterly growth. On the left-hand panel, we see for advanced Europe, and in the right side panel, we see it for emerging Europe. So what we see in advanced Europe is that we've had strong growth since 2014, and now we see that growth being reduced somewhat. We see growth coming down from about 2.5% in 2017 to levels around 1.52%. But we also note that for the majority of countries, growth is still above its potential. So it's still good growth for Europe. In emerging Europe, we saw a sharp pickup in growth in 2016, and we see that growth continuing, but it's at a somewhat lower pace of about 4 to 5%. And what we see is this here shows the reason for the revision in growth, and we see that this here shows the company's own assessment of of the economy. So we see manufacturing companies. This shows the index of their activity compared to the previous month. So if this is positive, it means that companies see an expansion. So we see companies, they continue to see expansion, but at a lower level than before. They're still growing, but they're not growing as much, which is consistent with the picture or the chart the previous chart. And on the right-hand panel, we see new orders and export orders. And here we see a clear pattern that it's dropping, but specifically for exports, which is a reflection of the weaker external, the weaker global demand, so weaker demand for European exports. And if we start looking ahead for the coming year, we see, as I said, a weaker external demand, weaker demand for European products. We also see energy prices going up, which reduces real incomes in Europe. And we see that capacity constraints are becoming a restriction on further expansion. So let's look at these each in turn. First of all, on the export growth. So export growth in Europe was exceptionally high. in 2017 at around 7.5%. It has now dropped down to more moderate levels of 3%. And we expect that this level of demand for European export is going to continue. We also see that the drop in exports is mainly for intermediary and capital goods, which makes up about 2/3 of European exports. What we also notice is that the US tariffs on steel and aluminum have not had a significant impact on European exports. And the reason for this is that Europe has limited exports of these goods to the United States. Then on energy prices, so commodity prices increased sharply from the beginning of the year, have increased by about 7%. The impact of this has been a reduction in real income in Europe. On average in Europe, the reduction in real income is about 0.5%, which weighs on consumption. And also higher oil prices has pushed up inflation on average by half a percent. For oil exporting Norway and Russia, the picture is the reverse. There, the terms of trade effect, so the effect of the increase in oil prices is a windfall gain of about 2% of GDP. Then moving on to capacity constraints, or we call maturing business cycles. So there are different ways of illustrating this. One way is to look at labor shortages. So this is the response to a survey question asking companies what capacity they are currently operating. And what we see is more and more companies are responding that they are operating above capacity, or a majority of companies are responding that they are operating above their long-run potential capacity. And what we see is more companies in emerging Europe are facing those capacity constraints. In the right-hand panel, it's the same, but it's the response to the question of whether they are facing labor shortages. And again, we see more companies are responding that they are facing labor shortages, and we see a substantial increase in that response among emerging market companies. Another way to look at the same issue again on capacity constraints is to look at unemployment. And what we see here is that in advanced Europe, unemployment is now below the pre-crisis level of 7%. And the same is the same situation for emerging market countries. And we also see that underemployment, so people who are marginally attached to the labor force, perhaps working part-time, that is also falling, and so we see a convergence between these two. So that's another indication. First of all, indication that more countries are facing labor shortages, and that this issue is more acute in emerging market countries. And the third way to look at this is just to look at wage growth. So what we would expect if demand for labor is higher than the supply of labor, we would see an increase in wages, and this is exactly what we see. So, and particularly in emerging Europe, where the nominal wage growth on average is 10%. In advanced Europe, We also see an increase in wages, but at around 2.5%. This is the situation that Ukraine faces, where we see a rapid wage growth. Part of that due to policies, but also part of that due to labor shortages. In part related also to labor migration in Ukraine. Then a fourth way to look at to illustrate the same thing is to look at output gaps. So output gaps are being defined as the current level of GDP compared to historical averages of GDP. So we see that with the exception of a few countries, Italy, Bulgaria, Bosnia, and Ukraine, all of Europe is now operating above its long-run GDP level. So all of this suggests that we're going to see a further moderation of growth in the coming years. And we would also expect to see that inflation is going to increase. We haven't seen that yet. So we see this here showing core inflation in European countries is still moderate, with the exception of a few countries like Turkey. But we see increases in headline inflation, gradual increase in headline inflation in Europe. All right, so let's move over to the outlook to future years. So generally, there's a positive outlook for 2018 and 19. Growth will continue to be high, although somewhat lower than we previously forecast. And we also see that the risks to the outlook have increased. So we see here that growth, as I mentioned in the introduction, it has in Europe, it has dropped from about 2.8% in 2017 to 2.3% in 2018, and will drop further to 1.9% in 2019. But it is, even with these levels, is still above its potential in most countries. The main driver of growth continues to be domestic demand, and this is driven by higher employment and higher wages. And so we see what I said here about being above its potential. So on the very right-hand column here shows the potential GDP. So what we see in 2019 is that growth will still be above its long-run potential. And if we look at Ukraine specifically, we see, it's a familiar picture with a very large output drop in 2014 and 15, and then a recovery and a stabilization of growth around 3%. And that growth is primarily driven by consumption. I see you taking pictures of this. We will post this presentation on our website, so you will have access to it. So, and so growth primarily driven by consumption, and then to some and supported by some investment, but that on net exports, so export minus imports, is still a drag on growth. The other thing two things that I want to point out with this is that, of course it is much better to have 3% growth than minus 10% growth that Ukraine had in 2010. But this should be put into context. So emerging Europe is growing on average 4 or 5%. So Ukraine is growing at a lower pace than emerging Europe. And also that with this large output drop that we saw in 2014 and 15, Ukraine needs to have higher growth just to catch up to where it was in 2013. Then, what is the explanation for the downward revision of growth in Europe? So we see we have revised down growth in 2018 and 19 in advanced Europe, and we kept the same growth in 2020. The key reason for this is exports, so weaker demand for European exports. For emerging Europe, we actually have an unchanged forecast for 2018, and then growth has been revised up by 0.2% in both 2019 and 20, and that growth is then being driven by a combination of consumption and investment. Now, moving over to the risks facing the economic outlook. So we see a number of risks. The risk in the short term, mainly on escalation of these trade tensions that we've seen in the first or in 2018, and then also tighter financial conditions. So that is going to make it more costly and difficult to borrow and finance investment. So on the trade tension side, this is a worry for Europe. As I said, Europe is a worry because Europe is more integrated into the value chain than other regions. So if we look at the value-added exports in Europe, is about 25% compared to about 17% in the Americas. So if there is if there are problems with or if there are trade tensions, that tends to have a larger impact on Europe than on other countries. What this here shows is the impact of a 25% tariff on cars and car parts. And we see that the impact is different. So Germany being a large car manufacturer, it would have a very large impact. But on average in Europe, it would reduce growth by about 0.1%. We have also we have modeled this trade tensions with a scenario with more trade restrictions and also taking into account confidence effects on the economy. So what we see if we would have an increase, so on with tariffs on Chinese goods and tariffs on car parts, and then together with market and confidence effects, the impact on European GDP could be as high as 0.45%. So a large, potentially a big issue for European economy. Then on financial conditions, what we see is so far for most countries in Europe, they have continued to have access to financial markets, with the exception of a few countries, one of them being Ukraine, that sees large spreads. I mean, the recent Eurobond was relatively expensive. Turkey, obviously, with the problems that they are going through, and then also Romania. But most other countries still have benign financial conditions. Were there to be tighter financial conditions, especially for emerging Europe, that could potentially have a big impact because of the relatively large debt that needs to be serviced and rolled over. So on the right hand, you see the average so holding of debt by non-residents in emerging market countries. So that's the green bar at the bottom, and then you see that several countries, including again Ukraine, they are above the average. And if we look here at Ukraine and the risk for Ukraine related to financial market conditions, this here shows the expansion of credit. So it's just a year-on-year expansion of credit with constant exchange rates, so taking out any depreciation effect that we otherwise would have seen. So there is now, we see an expansion, we see credit increasing, but it is mostly in the household sector, so not very little increase in the corporate sector, so very little credit going to investment that would increase productivity and growth in the future. We also, when we look at, we see the same picture when we look at foreign investment. So this here is showing foreign direct investment, the blue bar, and portfolio investment. So we see money flowing into Ukraine, but half of that is just portfolio investment. So it's not, it's just taking advantage of high interest rates in Ukraine, and foreign direct investment continues to be at historically low levels of around 2% of GDP. Then, moving on to policies. So what we see here is with these downward revisions and with the increase in risks, then it's becoming more and more important that policy is well tailored to deal with the situation. And we see also that the appropriate policy, it differs between countries. So Europe is not homogeneous in this sense. So we did see some countries where it's becoming important to avoid overheating and to start building fiscal buffers, so to reduce fiscal deficits and fiscal debts. Another group of countries where inflation is still well below targets. So there, in these countries, it's important to continue to provide monetary stimulus to get inflation rates up to target levels. And then in a third group of countries that it's becoming important to introduce structural reforms and increase growth potential for the future. So starting here on this issue of building fiscal buffers. So this here shows, I mean, it shows on the one axis the output gap. So we see if you move to the right, it's a positive output gap. So we see the majority of countries right now, as I've said before, they are now operating above its potential. They have a positive output gap. And then we see a measure of fiscal stimulus measured as the change in the cyclically adjusted balance on the other axis. So this here shows that most countries, they have number one, their economy is above potential, and they are also continuing to provide fiscal stimulus, which is right opposite to the textbook answer of what you should do when you are above potential. Then you should try to pour some cold water on the economy. You should try to reduce your debt and your deficit levels, build buffers, so the next time you go into a downturn, you actually have some firepower that you can use to stimulate the economy. So this is a problem, and this suggests that more countries should now work on reducing their deficit, and they should do it by addressing untargeted entitlement systems, which is a big proportion of the spending in European countries. They should also ensure that the government administration is efficient, so try to get the same result but by spending less money, and they should ensure that they are collecting all of the taxes that this population owes them. So then, what is the explanation? I mean, there are a lot of reasons why countries pursue pro-cyclical policies, so that they, or actually, what countries tend to do is that they are pro-cyclical in upturns. So when the economy is doing well, the government continues to spend. And then they are counter-cyclical in downturns. So when you then go into contraction, then they spend even more. And one part of that is politics. That politicians they want people to like them, and they know that people like them when they lower taxes and when they increase spending. Another explanation is that has to do with the difficulty of actually assessing where you are in the cycle. So now, just as a reminder of what the output gap is. So that is the difference between what the current GDP, actual GDP, and your long-run potential GDP, or sometimes called full employment GDP. So what it says is that sometimes the factories they're not at full capacity. They may be closed down for some days, and there are people who are unemployed in the economy. So then the economy could do better than it's currently doing. That means that you have a negative output gap. Or conversely, you could have an output gap when the factories they're adding shifts or they're working weekends, and then some people who would actually rather not work, they're engaged in the workforce. Then you have a positive output gap. So this here, but the problem here is that is methodologically is difficult to know with certainty what the potential level is. So what should you benchmark your current GDP level against? What this shows here is that when you do it in real time, so when you're trying to assess what is the output gap right now in Ukraine, then you tend to overestimate you tend to underestimate, yes, of course, underestimate the output gap. So you think that you are doing worse than what you are actually doing. So that would justify providing fiscal stimulus. So you spend more, you rack up higher deficits and higher debts. And then when you look at that with more information, you look historically, then you realize actually we were doing better than what we thought we were doing. And what this leads to, as what we see here, is that debt levels tend to gradually increase. You never get your deficit down, and your debt tend just to increase. This here shows for emerging Europe and for advanced Europe the level of debt. So the bar shows the average, or weighted average debt so before the crisis in 2008, and what it is now. And we see that in both emerging and advanced Europe, the average level of debt is now, despite this unprecedentedly long output expansion that we've had since 2010 up until now, we still see that debt is higher than it was in 2008. So countries have not been able to successfully reduce its debt levels. And we see in the the average of the sort of the top the highest debt countries, which is the dot, we see the same thing. So it's much higher than what it was before the crisis. And when we look at Ukraine, we see the debt, which is the line here, that increased in 2014 and 15 and 16. That was part of that was the fiscal deficits and the quasi-fiscal deficits in 2014. Part of it was the recapitalizations of the banking sector that became necessary, and the cost for the deposit guarantee fund of bailing out depositors. And of course, another explanation was the depreciation of the exchange rate, which just had increased the part of the debt that's denominated in foreign currency. And we see since then, so debt increased to more than 80% of GDP, and since then, thanks to prudent fiscal policy, so the fiscal deficit being kept low, and the primary balance being in surplus, and thanks to the elimination of the deficits in Naftogaz, the debt level is gradually coming down in Ukraine. It's still probably on the high side, but it's moving in the right direction. So as with other European countries, the policy recommendation for Ukraine is to continue this and continue to keep the fiscal deficit under control. And finally, something on monetary policy. So what we see in Europe is that inflation, especially in advanced Europe, in most countries, is still below target. That suggests that these countries should continue to keep their policy rates low to try to get a durable increase in the inflation rate up to the target level. On the contrast, what we see in emerging Europe is that there has been an increase in the inflation rate, and in some countries it's even above the target rate. And for these countries, monetary policy should normalize, and there should be a clear communication that monetary policy is going to support containment of inflation. So that's it. That's European economy. Happy to answer any questions that you may have. Just one thing. So this particular presentation is about the European regional economic outlook. So I would prefer not to talk about something that I'm sure you want to talk about, which is the IMF program. We'll have another venue and another gathering for that. But so I would prefer just to talk about this event on the European economy.
Mr. Luнгман, thanks for the great presentation. Georgi Tikhi, Ukrinform. I want to ask a little bit more a global question, probably, because obviously you were talking about risks. And Europe is not independent from the global economy. And there's been lately some prognosis, like you read it in media from various experts, saying that we might be like sleepwalking into a new financial crisis, like the one we saw in 2008, 2009, like debt-related crisis. Do you consider this prognosis alarmist, or you think it's rather realist?
We don't see that. I mean, we see that ratios are. I mean, they're better now than they were in 2017. We also see that the regulation of the financial sector is a lot stronger than it was, but we also see risks in certain regions. So in Europe, for example, the housing prices, housing pricing is an issue that we see particularly in the Nordic countries. So asset valuation, and another. I mean, the other issue, and to come back to this, is that it's a policy space that countries have, because they have not dealt with the increase in public debt, and they've maintained high deficits and debt. So that could limit their ability to provide stimulus during the next downturn.
Mikhail Harchuk, Interfact Ukraine. I would like to clarify the picture on page 20. Did I understand right that in 2020 the impact of trade wars will be the most serious on the European economy?
Okay, I should explain this. So what this is we're modeling here. So we are seeing what an imaginary scenario, what impact that would have. That imaginary scenario is a 25% tariff on car and car parts, and check this. What the so it's a 25% tariff on car parts. It's also 20. If I remember correctly, there's also a tariff on Chinese goods. Those, and with retaliation also on those. Actually what in this this modeling, what happens is that the short run effect of the tariffs is actually to boost European GDP. So Europe would, in the short term, they would benefit from the imposition of tariffs on Chinese goods and on car parts. Then that's going to drop off. So in a few years' time, then it starts to have a negative effect. Really the big effect here comes from the confidence effect, so people becoming worried about the global economic outlook, and the market effect of that, so marketing seizing up. That's a big negative effect that we see in 2020, and then those things, they gradually they phase out. But this is a hypothetical modeling of what trade sanctions could lead to in Europe. The same as the previous one. This one is also just an estimate. I mean, we don't have these tariffs on car and car parts. This is an estimate of what the effect of that would be on European countries.
I'm just interested because Ukraine in 2020 will have high payments on debt, so even hypothetical estimations about what impact might be on Ukraine from this influence.
Yeah, trade. That I can't answer. We even need to model that separately. But I think more than that, what is this issue is the. So this shows, on the left-hand side, shows the sovereign spreads. So it shows basically that it's becoming expensive for Ukraine to borrow for a number of reasons, number of concerns with Ukraine's economy and Ukraine's external debt. So that is what I see as being perhaps a more or bigger concern for Ukraine.
More specifically about Ukraine, did you estimate the impact of Russian sanctions?
No, we haven't estimated.
And besides that, according to assessment of the government, the 23% hike on gas tariffs should effect in about 10 or 16% hike in heat tariffs. What are your estimations about this impact? Because right now some experts and also heating companies saying that the effect will be much higher than 10 or 16%, but about even 70%.
So on the economy, I mean it will be a temporary increase in inflation. I think that the inflation, the impact of that is about 0.5%. So inflation will, but that's a one-off effect because you're just moving up to another level, and then a year later, because inflation is the increase in price. So you're just moving to another level. So as long as you're not up at that level, then you see the increase. I think that given that there is a utility subsidy program in place that cushions the impact of the higher gas tariffs and heating tariffs on poor households, I don't think we will see a large impact on consumption from this, which would so I think the overall macroeconomic impact of this is going to be very limited.
Юрий Дачатов, «Украинские новины», я не по-английски. Скажите мне, пожалуйста, согласована ли позиция по введению налога на выведенный капитал? Это первый вопрос МВФ. И второй вопрос. Считает ли МВФ, что предварительное условие по поводу определения новой цены газа и ПСО на сегодняшний день, когда принято постановление правительства, уже выполнено? Спасибо.
As I said, I would rather not go into those questions now because those are more related to our program and our program negotiations. So I think I'm happy to answer them, but not at this event.
Maria Tsaturyan, RBC Ukraine. Could you, Mr. Luнгман, could you mention maybe 3 main points of what restrains the growth of Ukrainian economy? Just 3 or 4, just to clear all the situation you were talking about.
Okay. Okay. So I think that the key ones, two of them have to do with macro, and the other one has to do with a business environment. So the first one is fiscal policy. So ensuring that fiscal policy is contained. So we already see that Ukraine is the perception of the macroeconomic stability in Ukraine is still fragile. I mean, there is macroeconomic stability, but there also is concern in markets that what would happen if there would be if the fiscal stability would be lost. The other one is on nominal interest rates, which is related to inflation. So constraint for domestic investment is the high nominal interest rates with a policy rate of 18.5%. Obviously, it's very difficult to finance investment by borrowing in banks, and that's what we saw. I showed that. Where did I show this? Oh, here. So we see here the lending to corporates, the red line here, which is very close. I mean, the year-on-year increase is very close to zero, and one explanation of that is the high nominal interest rates. But the way to address this is to bring down inflation, because as long as inflation is high, then the central bank they're basically doing the right thing in tightening policy to get inflation down. And here, fighting inflation is the primary responsibility of the central bank, but it's also the responsibility of the government to make sure that that wage policies and fiscal policies contributes to low and stable inflation. And then the third issue, so if we want to get investment in Ukraine to increase and get foreign direct investment and greenfield investment into actually building something that is going to generate growth, then the business environment needs to improve. Things like secure property rights it needs to strengthen. I mean, investors they want confidence. If they're going to put their money into the Ukrainian economy with a perspective of 15-20 years, they want to have assurances that they are going to be fairly treated in all possible scenarios.
Natalia Detskevich, Kyivpost. You told that foreign direct investments coming to Ukraine reached modest 2% of GDP. Can you say it in numbers? What reasons are for so low level, and on which level it's supposed to be like identified as a normal?
It's hard to say was normal, but I mean, if we look historically, it's difficult in Ukraine though to with foreign direct investment, but I mean, it used to be in before 2013, it used to be around 8 billion. Now it's down to around 2 billion. But then we need to distinguish, first of all, what of that is so greenfield investment, so investment into in actually creating something new, and brownfield, which is just selling of Ukrainian assets. But then there's also the issue of what we call round tripping. So there are several large Ukrainian enterprises that are registered in foreign jurisdictions that, you know, their profit from Netherlands or from Cyprus, when they come back as being foreign direct investment. Then, but that may be temporary. There's also an issue, just a classification issue. So when some foreign-owned banks, when they were asked to recapitalize, they reclassified their debt to their debt into capital. So I mean, the same money is there. It's just classified from debt to capital. But it's hard to say what it should be. But it should be. It's clear that it should be substantially higher than what it is now. But I don't want to give a number. But you know,
mostly they come to the brownfield in Ukraine.
No, I think now, as I said, we don't have accurate numbers for this, but it's probably about 2/3 of it is actual foreign direct investment of what we see now.
Natalia Zinets, Reuters. You mentioned that Ukrainian economic growth is below its potential level. Could you give us reasons why it is now like that, and if you see in foreseeable future it may change what Ukraine has to do for this? And maybe repetition about inflation, but your forecast shows that Ukrainian inflations should go down next in 19 and 20, despite your general forecast is that inflation can grow, can increase. Could you explain better what allows Ukraine to decrease inflation into next years?
Okay, I hope I didn't say that Ukraine's is below its potential, because it's
Like different, not green, but orange color in terms of Ukraine's growth.
see, so we had, I think, in this one.
No, the map of Europe,
Ah, okay.
where most of countries are in green,
Mm-hmm.
and Ukraine is in
Yeah. Okay.
this one.
Yeah. So. Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, it's always difficult to assess potential GDP, which you need in order to say, are you above or below your GDP? It's particularly difficult to do in a country that is going through some structural transformation, like Ukraine's economy. So, I mean, when we do this assessment, we basically apply the normal methodology for assessing potential GDP, which is to look historically, and you basically have a trend of GDP, and then you extrapolate that in is a simplification, but you extrapolate that, and then you get to what potential GDP would be. And on the basis of that, Ukraine is slightly below, but it's slightly below its potential. But that is assuming that everything else is constant, and Ukraine has I mean, say a thing like our assessment of the cost of corruption is that reduces GDP growth by about 2% per year compared to European countries. So if you were Ukraine to bring down the level of corruption to average European levels, then growth would not be 3%, it would be 5%. But you know that would, in a way, that would change the growth potential. Another issue like that has to do with the agricultural market. So, you know, if we would have an active, dynamic trade in agricultural land, that would unlock investment into agriculture. We think that productivity in agriculture would see a big increase. So I mean it's hard to say what the underlying potential of the Ukrainian economy is, but our sense is that it is substantially higher than the current growth levels of 3%. But in order to unlock that potential, some big reforms need to be done. On inflation, so we do think that inflation is going to come down. That it will come down towards 6% by the end of next year, and it's combination of the tight monetary policy that the MBU is pursuing and moderation of the inflation expectations of the population. What? No, not average. No, end year inflation will come down towards 6%.
Anastasia Zanuda, BBC Ukraine. I would like to continue on this theme of economic growth. You said that 3% is much more better than minus 10%, but it's still lower than the neighbors. I would like to ask about two recent initiatives which in some point could boost the economic growth in Ukraine. The most recent one is issuing bonds for certain industries. It was actually backed by the National Bank, but some say that it could mean hidden emission. Have you estimated, have you somehow, do you have thoughts about this idea? And the next one is this text on withdrawn capital.
Again.
If we put aside the program with the IMF, the president is saying that this tax can boost Ukrainian economy. And you said that we are much more slower than we could be. If we put aside the program with the IMF, in your view, can it really be a driver of Ukrainian economy?
Can it be?
Can this tax be really a driver for Ukrainian economy? A driving force, a boost?
Okay. So the first one, I think this bond issuance, if I understand correctly, this is an idea that was presented by the MBU Council, not the board of yeah. So I have no comments on that. And I also don't particularly want to say too much about the exit capital tax, but I think what I want to, I mean, what we do want to achieve is an increase in investment. That is necessary. Ukrainian investment is very low. It's between 16 and 17% of GDP. In many other Central European countries, it's 23, 24, 25% of GDP. And also, just given the depreciation of assets in Ukraine, I mean, in a way you could argue that it should be higher than what we see in Central and Eastern European countries. So how do we achieve that? I mean, there was a question on the top three things that you could do to boost economic growth, and what I said is to bring down nominal interest rates. That is going to help with investment, but that can only happen when inflation has come down. The other thing, what we see as holding investment back, is the business environment. So it is property rights, judicial system, corruption, and those things need to be addressed before people are willing to invest, regardless of whether it's your own money, your own profits that you've created in a company, or whether it's borrowed money. Then I also, just as a general comment on, not on the ECT, but on tax changes. Generally, what we see is there's merit to maintain a stable tax system, both rates and the tax basis. That is also that creates a good business environment, and we don't we haven't seen that the current tax system in Ukraine that is typically not reported as being one of the top reasons why investors are reluctant to put more money into the economy.
All right. Це, напевно, буде від пана Михайла вже останнє запитання. Дякуємо.
To clarify on this question, what is your stance about the last proposition to impose such tax regime only for small and medium enterprises?
I don't want. We're getting very close into sort of our position and the negotiations that we have. So I'd rather not go into that now. I mean, I'd like to more talk about the European and the Ukrainian economy, not specific proposals.
Дякуємо, шановні колеги, за ваш час. Дякуємо, що ви завітали. Прес-релізи, хто ще не взяв у вашому розпорядженні. Дякуємо. До наступних зустрічей. Вона буде або сьогодні ввечері, або завтра.